Good morning, and to our friends joining us abroad, good evening. Welcome to Mirage Talks. Today, we welcome Darie MT to touch on the subject, winning the founder stock battle. Darie, thank you so much for joining us. Let's get started.
Hi, everybody. Okay, get started. One second. Nice to meet you guys. My name's Darie. I'm a lawyer. I've been practicing now for about 15 years, almost 15, 13 years now. I'm a business lawyer, and I started my career in Israel and working as a corporate lawyer over there for a bunch of firms. And in 2013, I moved to the United States, and I was practicing, doing the same thing, working with startups and investors and practicing corporate law and doing a little bit of commercial work as well, in Boston and in New York. And in 2015, I transitioned over to another firm in Los Angeles, and I opened up my old firm, Pearl Cohen, which actually has an Israeli presence. I opened up their LA office in Santa Monica in 2016 and in 2017, sorry. And in 2021, I decided to go out on my own and work with my clients and just opened up my own shop. So that's a little bit about me. And you can see with this slide, you can just see a little bit of the different places that I've been practicing and where I've lived. And now, actually, I forgot the last thing. In 2021, I also moved to Orange County, which is where I live with my family now. So the title of this presentation is Winning the Founder Stock Battle. So before we get started, really jumping into it, I think it makes sense to discuss some key terms. And when I define them, you should know that I'm not trying to define them in a very formal way. I just want to get, kind of a very quick definition so we can kind of get on our way and start analyzing. So first, what's a founder? A founder is just somebody that starts a company. What's equity? Equity is a little bit more involved. You can't really just say it quickly, or equity or stock, quickly say exactly what it is. But the first thing that it is basically an ownership right in a company. It's an actual right of ownership. But understanding what ownership in a company really means is a little bit more involved, because a company is sort of a legal construct. So what ownership right means, and this is gonna come up a little bit later, is it's just a basket of economic rights and management rights. Economic rights are like rights to cash flows in the future, or rights to distributions, or if the company is sold, a right to the proceeds from that sale. And management rights are things like the right to vote, or the right to require your approval if certain decisions want to be made. And the last thing I wanted to mention when we talk about equity is this idea of derivative equity, because even though I know it's kind of another layer of complexity, it's something that comes up all the time with startups. Because when you're giving equity to employees or consultants or advisors, and oftentimes to banks as well, what you're giving is not really the actual stock in the company. You're giving them a right to buy that stock in the future. And that's the way I refer to that is sort of like a derivative right. It's not the actual ownership right itself. So that's just something I want us to keep in mind also. So that's equity. What's a battle? So I'm being sort of euphemistic when I'm referring to this as being a battle, but really what it is sort of competing interests, these adverse competing interests, and they can be either, sort of an internal conflict that you have, an internal battle that you have, or it can be a battle with sort of an external forces, or battle within your team. Equity brings up a lot of these issues because this is sort of the main value driver of the company. This is really where people are receiving their main economic benefit. So more on this idea of what these three conflicts are, and I think it might be helpful to consider these, which of these three categories applies when we're talking about some of these examples later. So first is sort of this internal battle. When I say internal, I'm referring to internal in like inside the team, where you have competing interests between a founder and other team members relating to equity. So figuring out, if you're two founders, figuring out who gets more equity, for example, that would be sort of an internal battle. Or the decision whether to issue options to a new employee or to top them off. Like, let's say they've been working there for a while and you have to decide whether you want to give them more equity for work that they've done in addition to their existing allocation. That would be sort of an internal battle. An external battle here would be the decisions around equity and giving it to sort of giving it mostly to investors, but sometimes there's external forces that kind of influence equity, like lenders. But that would be an external battle, a battle that you, wearing the company hat and also wearing your own personal hat, like this is my asset and I don't want to be diluted. That's you're kind of trying to protect yourself from this from folks that are not really on your core team. And the third battle, which I think is a very significant piece all the time, and oftentimes this is really where the core sort of conflict exists, is really with yourself, because you always have two competing interests when you're discussing how to distribute equity when you're a founder. One is trying to make the pie bigger, trying to make the company more valuable by bringing in critical pieces, by getting access to capital. But also there's this issue of every time you give out some equity, you lose some of your own. Because at the end of the day, it's not about how many shares you have, it's what percentage of the company typically. And I'm kind of simplifying, but it's really what percentage of the company you have. And since there's only 100%, every time you give away some equity, you're losing. Okay, so to get started, I thought maybe we could think of an example here. So starting in June 2023, Abe and Ava finished studying comparative literature at Mirage State University. A couple months later, in September 2023, they start learning about generative AI. They take an online class. And then a couple months later, in May 2024, they decided to found ChitChat, which is a generative AI startup that's focusing on ideas for small talk during the initial few minutes of Zoom meetings. When they decide to found that startup, they decide to form a company, incorporate, and split equity between them. A couple months later, they decide to bring on a third founder, a technical co-founder, somebody that has some coding experience, and they're going to give that person some equity. About half a year later, they successfully raise their first round of financing. This is going to be sort of what we call a straight equity financing, not where they're actually issuing stock. And they issue the investors some equity, some stock. And then in March 2026, the company onboards employees and consultants and advisors, and they issue them some equity. And then finally, in June 2026, they have a product that's ready and they start gaining some traction. So what I wanted to focus on for this discussion are the first three equity events between May 2024 and February 2025. It's really a span of a very short period of time. This is when the founders decide on the equity split between them. They bring on a co-founder and give the co-founder some equity as well. And they raise money in a financing round. So these are the sort of the three battles that we're going to discuss. How do they win these battles, or how do they approach these battles? So first of all, before we start talking about how they win these battles, I wanted to have a little bit more of a general note on whether these battles are even important in the first place. So here's three viewpoints on whether they are important. So the first viewpoint would be, yes, this is definitely important because we're talking about a big piece of the business that is being transacted in these three events. If you think about it, let's say these founders were 50-50 to start. And let's say they brought in the third, when they brought in the third co-founder, that it would be equal between all of them. Let's say then everybody had 33% each. The code Abe or Ava is giving up 17% of their equity immediately as of that second event. And even in the first event, if you think about the swings, the size of the swings between Ava and Abe deciding on who gets what equity, these swings can be very, very large. And this is very characteristic because we're in the very early days of the business. In the early days of the business, when we talk about equity, we talk about big equity, because big percentages, simply because the company's not worth as much. And to make things interesting, you have to give a significant piece to stakeholders in order for them to be involved. So from that vantage point, yes, this is a very important discussion because compared to later times, we're talking about a lot more equity that's being transacted. The second reason that I think that this is important is because what you give today is going to affect what you're going to give tomorrow. It's not just about, a lot of times it's not just about what you, it's not just about what you give, what you can argue is fair to an external third party. Once you bring them into your company, they want to know that they're fair inside the company. They want to know that what they're getting is a deal that makes sense for what's acceptable inside the ecosystem of the company itself. This goes for founders and for employees and for other folks that are getting equity allocations, but it's especially true for investors. So for investors, if you end up in your first round of financing giving away, or not saying giving away, but it would say like if you maybe giving away is the wrong way to put it, I think. If you end up granting a lot of oversight and controls or to this investor, or giving them special economic rights, there's an increased likelihood, that future investors will ask for the same thing. And they may not otherwise they may not have asked for this. The reason is that investors usually look at whatever past investors gave as sort of a baseline. And you can try to argue it away, but it's sort of an uphill battle typically. So that's another reason why why this is very important, because the early decisions you make around equity in the company affect the later allocations that you're giving. But there's a counterpoint here. And the counterpoint is that equity is flexible, that mistakes are usually not fatal with a company. If you end up giving too much equity to a founder, and let's say the founder simply has it, we're not talking about there's no way to get it back. It's a lot of times it's a very difficult situation, but it's not necessarily fatal. Why is this? Because if the company loses, everybody loses. All the stakeholders lose. So the decisions you make are important, but you can also take them with sort of a grain of salt and understand that things are not necessarily written in stone here. You can change things. It's oftentimes very painful. Sometimes it might involve, friendships going away, relationships changing, and even litigation, which would be a very extreme case, but one that definitely exists. But the idea is that there is sort of this flexibility here. So it's important to structure things properly, definitely. And what it really primarily gives you is time to focus on other things. Because once there is a problem with equity and you have to fix it, it may be fixable, and it usually requires a tremendous amount of effort, and it becomes a huge focal point for the company. So the first battle I'd like to talk about is the founder equity split. So we have Abe and Ava, who are deciding on the equity split between them, and they have to figure out what the terms of the equity between them will be. So first of all, what percentage is each of them going to get, and what are the terms around these allocations they're each going to get. Now they together are now 100% of the company. So the first thing to think about when they're deciding on the equity split is how much are they going to be involved in the business? A lot of times when founders get started on a new project together, they oftentimes have other engagements, whether they have another job or they have other projects they're working on. And the first question is, are they going all in? Are they going to become full-time on this? Or if they're not going to be full-time, how much time, how much effort, better yet, are they going to allocate? Sometimes it's not necessarily reflected perfectly in time, but time is typically a nice indicator of effort. The second question is, how important are they going to be to this project? What piece are they bringing to the table? Now, sometimes with respect to both of these things, you don't have to know all this stuff at the outset. What's important here is to put together sort of a framework that can kind of encompass how you can determine fairly at each point in time, or at certain points in time, rather, what a fair equity split would be between them. And that's sort of what this third point is when I mention flexibility. So the idea is to create a structure that will allow people to live their lives when you're talking about founder splits. Because even though you may have big dreams together in the beginning, things evolve over time and everybody has their own career path. And what's important is to make sure that the company can survive a change in the relationship between the founders, or the founders' relationship with the business. And that also that the founders themselves can survive it, that it's not going to create a terrible conflict between them. So the way that this is typically done, and this is the way it's done with all folks that are getting equity as that's called compensatory equity that they're getting as compensation or for their services, not from an investment, is by setting forth sort of a schedule where the equity is released and it vests over time. So there's two types of vesting that we can consider when we're talking about founders, and generally, but very much it's very much the case with founders. One is time-based vesting, saying your equity vests if you are sticking with this project for a long period of time. And there's different sort of market standards for how this vesting should work. But the main point is that it kind of vests over time. So if you stay for a certain period of time, then you get the full allocation of this equity. But sometimes a more important type of vesting for founders is milestone vesting, where your shares are released to you, or maybe you're released from a repurchase option, or basically the idea is you actually get the shares completely when certain things happen. This can be you coming on full time. It could just be you deciding to make that effort or to dedicate your resources to this business. Or it could be achieving a sort of milestone within a goal of the company, a milestone within the company. Maybe it's a product milestone. Maybe it's setting things up operationally within the company, showing that you've kind of you've contributed to the company in a certain way. And what's nice about these, again, is that it allows founders, if they decide to go a different way, to have an easy way to exit. So they can exit without having to deal with the complexity of owning a big chunk of the company and being in that uncomfortable situation where they own, let's say, as much or close to or within the same strata as another founder, but the other founder is the one that's working full time there. And this one is kind of left and is working on another project. A complicated situation that arises is when there is no vesting schedule, and then an investor comes in, and the investor sees that there's this sort of equity on the cap table. And when I say cap table, I'm referring to the sort of list where everybody's where you can see this like ledger where everybody's equity is shown. And they see that there's a bunch of equity that's allocated to a person that didn't invest money and isn't involved with the business anymore. And oftentimes what the investor may require is to go back to this ex-founder and find out a way and get them to relinquish their equity or relinquish a big chunk of it. And that can become very time consuming and complicated. But the reason the reason that the investor wants this is because they want to have a cap table that makes sense for everybody. Oftentimes when an investor says, go back to an ex-founder and make sure that they relinquish this equity, they're not necessarily doing it for their interest, because when the investor comes in and gets a certain percentage of equity for a certain amount of money, they're going to get that percentage no matter what, regardless of, they're getting their percentage no matter what. If they're going to get 30% for $1 million, they're going to get their 30% at the end of the day. They're doing it for the other founder, the other co-founder, who's now going to lose a bunch of equity and is losing more equity than they should lose, or that they would otherwise lose if they could convince this ex co-founder to give up some of their equity. So the idea is, another point here that we can see is that there's a lot of different incentives involved. And what's important to investors a lot of times, and is very important to co-founders, is keeping everybody motivated, keeping everybody aligned. So what having a flexible infrastructure can do is it kind of ensures alignment if different things happen. So that's the first battle. The second battle is when another co-founder joins later. So it's very similar, a lot of the same considerations, except that the next co-founder is joining at a different point in time. So the first thing that usually comes up is, so wait a minute, they didn't come in from the very beginning. Should they be getting the same kind of equity treatment if they weren't here from day one? So a lot of times founders choose to value the contributions that were made to date and discount the amount of equity that another co-founder that's coming in later will get. And that's because they weren't there even during the formulation stage, even during the time where the idea for the business was being sort of incubated. So a question that arises that you have to kind of and decide on is how much progress was already made. The second point here is what role this person's going to have and whether they're going to be made a co-founder. Sometimes co-founder titles are kind of thrown around for reasons that are unrelated to sort of their role as sort of critical drivers of the company, and it makes sense for certain reasons. Sometimes you can't afford to pay somebody, and you can't afford to maybe give them that much equity, but you can give them a title. But one of the things you have to decide when you're deciding on an equity allocation of a co-founder is really what their role is going to be. Are they going to be, at this point, maybe a key hire that you can't really pay necessarily as much? Or are they really going to be sort of driving the business? And the last sort of consideration kind of relates to the previous one, which is how are they being compensated? So when we talk about equity compensation, it's usually part of a package. It's always part of a package. I mean, there's always another component, and the other component is cash. And cash could be anywhere from 0 to, it could be infinitely large, but there is always another component. This is always part of a compensation package, even for co-founders. And typically the reason that co-founders receive sort of these big allocations is because they came in early when the company wasn't valued very much. And oftentimes they're sacrificing on what they could receive in the open market in terms of cash compensation. The third battle that we're going to quickly talk about is the equity investor. So when we think about an investor coming in and being issued stock, the first thing that comes up is valuation. So this is, the mother of all equity discussions, is how much is the equity really worth? What's the value of the company? So a rule of thumb, what I've seen successful founders do in the past is not go too high and not go too low. So there's risks to doing either. So if you go too low, obviously it affects the percentage of equity that you're going to hold. So the lower the valuation that you have, the greater the percentage of the company that the investor is going to receive for the same amount of money. So the first thing is, if you go too low, you're going to lose on the equity that you have, and you're going to get diluted. And this could be bad, not just because at the end of the day you're going to receive a little bit less if the company has a liquidity event or it exits, but it's also bad because it can affect your motivation over time, especially because oftentimes the first money you take is not necessarily the last money you're going to take. So it's important to not go too low. And also there also is a signaling aspect to this. Going low can also signal where your next round is going to be. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So the other extreme is going too high. And going too high is problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, if you manage to get an investor, that's great, but oftentimes going too high is a big reason why you're having difficulty raising. Excuse me. Plenty of founders and plenty of companies just don't have a realistic understanding of what investors are willing, or what valuation they need, or maybe actually let me put it a different way. They don't founders have to justify the valuation they want to raise at, and I think some founders don't have a strong aren't able to get there in terms of justification, and so it's just harder to raise. But another reason why you don't want to raise at too high a valuation is because it ties you to a certain performance threshold, and startups it's very unclear how things are going to go in startups. I mean, they're highly risky ventures, especially if you're a startup that is kind of still in the process of identifying its market or its product, or how to grow its product or how to scale its product, which is pretty much every startup. At every point, even if you have a product that you're selling, it's sorry, I jumped for a second. So going too high ties you to ties you to a valuation that you're going to have to exceed later. Typically, when you receive investment from an institutional investor like a venture capital fund, or even sort of angels today, one of the rights that these investors receive is a right against an anti-dilution right, which means that if you issue at a lower round at a lower valuation later on, they're going to get more equity, basically. the value of their shares is going to become adjusted. And in general, it's just it just makes it harder for you to raise again if you raise at a lower valuation. So raising at a valuation that's too high sometimes puts you in a situation where it's not easy for you to keep on raising. You can't show that you're progressing forward, which is one of the things that you're always trying to show as a startup. So that's a reason why you don't want to raise a too high a valuation. Another consideration here are all the special rights that you're going to give to these investors. So there's two categories. There's two main baskets of rights that compose what stock really is, and that's the economic and the management. And on the management side, a lot of times, investors want you to provide oversight into their investment. They want to know what's going on in the company. They want to receive sort of financial statements, and oftentimes they also want oversight on decision making. They want to be able to shepherd you to success, and they want to make sure there's some controls on how you make your decisions. But that's great for your growth. But there's also other rights that investors sometimes ask for that may be sort of hidden, that may be protecting not necessarily the company's interest, but their own interest, it's perfectly fine. But that's also the type of rights that investors ask for. Rights where you need their permission to raise money again would be one example that's as common, that is very common, and also at the same time fairly extreme. In addition, there's also a set of economic rights that investors typically ask for. And I'm not going to go into them right now because I think that's not necessarily the purview of this discussion. But I think it's important to note that there are things that can help guide us in deciding on what basket of rights we want to offer to investors when we are issuing them equity. And because this happens so often, and there are market standards. One such standard are the sort of model documents that the National Venture Capital Association has, where they give you sort of it's like a template legal document with many different options, where you can kind of choose among what's viewed as market standards. But you should know that all market standards sort of skew a certain way, and this document set, for example, sort of skews towards the venture capital community, which means that it's not necessarily pro-founder. The last thing to consider here is the sort of X factor that investors provide, because investors getting money is important in the first place. I mean, obviously that's critical to having the ability to grow. Typically for startups, not all startups. Some startups don't need money, but for most startups. But there's also another value add that you can usually that investors can sometimes provide. So sometimes if investors are, they may want to protect their investment and make sure that the company succeeds by making introductions, or by helping guide the company and using their experience if they have relevant experience to the business. And sometimes they don't have this experience, which is perfectly fine. And in which case, it's important to sort of identify if the investor is going to be a value add. The last thing is sort of a prestige factor. So a lot of times when a high-profile investor invests, it can help the company just by the mere fact that it validates the business in some way. It's very difficult to show traction in early days, especially when products are very forward-looking. And having sort of any stamp of validation helps, and having certain investors invest kind of helps with that journey as well. So those are the three sort of cases I wanted to just roughly talk about, so that before we can start sort of discussing this, in the open. And I just wanted to note two things that I admire about founders that I've seen operate within these, in these different situations. One is founders that make sure their business gets off the ground. When they're, and I'm talking about with respect to issuing equity. Finding the deals. Now, in the beginning, these deals might not be pretty. You give up more than you want to in the beginning. Either to another co-founder or to or an investor, because in the beginning, oftentimes it's very, very difficult to get going. But those founders that are able to strike those preliminary deals, understanding that even though they are sort of critical to the allocation of equity that they have, and it may dilute them tremendously, those founders that are able to piece together those deals to get to the next stage are something I always admire a lot, especially when it's sometimes not not an obvious path. The second thing that I wanted to highlight that I admire in founders that are dealing with these equity situations is finding ways to sort of creatively retain control. So sometimes the reality is going to be that you're gonna have to give up some control, either because an investor is asking for something very reasonable. You may not want to give it, but it's a reasonable ask and it makes sense within the context, or because you don't have a choice, or simply this is just where the company is, kind of back to the first point of it being reasonable. I always admire founders that find ways to retain some kind of control on either on the edges or understanding the sort of soft power dynamic. So understanding also that, the answer isn't always in what's in the contract. What you give it, even though this is something that obviously, makes me very nervous as a lawyer when founders talk about sort of like soft power dynamics or the reality of a situation, because, this reality can change. I always admired founders that can sort of navigate this situation, that understand that sometimes you have to give up certain things, but it doesn't mean that you stop negotiating. You agree to the sort of premise of giving something up, but you make sure that you have some escape hatches and that you have some kind of plan. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, guys. I just wanted to give you guys some things to think about on these issues. And I think now I would love to open up a discussion on this and hear what you guys think about any of your experiences. And if you have any questions for me on this stuff.
Thank you, Darie. We actually do have one question that was sent to the chat box, so we can start with that one. It says, perhaps I'm jumping the gun and this will be addressed. How are exercise prices of options determined so that on one hand, they are low enough to provide meaningful, positive incentivization, high financial upside without creating a long-term equity drain when every employee who leaves the company doesn't exercise their vested options?
Okay. Let me see this question. So that was a long one, a long question. So the first thing is about how exercise prices are determined. So exercise prices are typically just fair market. In the United States, they're just the fair market value of the options. So you typically, when you issue options to employees, it's part of their compensatory package. And the goal is to give them a price that's as low as possible. So what you do is in order to not trigger sort of adverse income tax implications or consequences from the issuance of from the granting of these options or when they're exercised, you have to make sure that they're issued at fair market value. And the way you determine fair market value is typically, the board has the right to determine it itself, but you typically use a third-party appraiser later on in the company's journey. In the beginning, sometimes you kind of eyeball it yourselves if you can't afford it, but later on you get an appraisal. It's called a 409A appraisal in the United States, and that's what determines the exercise price. But as far as making sure that folks don't exercise and trade them all at once, That's a good point. So oftentimes when you're issuing this type of equity, you understand that employees are in it for they're there for the economic benefit of these options. They want to they want to get the their compensation if there's a distribution or if there's an exit, one of those situations. So you don't, oftentimes you can kind of limit their ability to transfer these shares. You can limit the underlying shares of this option, or you can completely limit their ability to vote. Sometimes, what's inside of these option plans is that the CEO is given a proxy to vote the shares on behalf of these option holders. So basically limiting the benefit of this type of equity to just sort of a specific economic right that they have. And there's other ways that you can limit it this time in terms of when they can exercise and in what situation, but I hope I answered that question a little bit.
And we have another question as well. Actually, we've got a few here. So the first question we'll start with is, what are the acceptable ranges for deep tech seed round funding percentage equity?
Usually I see like 15 to, this is a broad range, but like 15 to 30% you see as like for equity, but it's hard to say for seed found. So when you say seed round funding, I'm assuming that you're referring to the actual, we call straight equity round, where it's like actually stock is being given. And the reason I say, I'm trying to make sure that that is clear is because oftentimes today, the first investment money that's received is in the form of a sort of convertible instrument, like a convertible note or a safe, which is it was very much like a convertible note. And in that case, it's very difficult to figure out what percentage of equity is really being relinquished. Even though it's very important to figure it out, it's just a little bit more complicated to calculate. But yeah, I see like, 15 to 30%, with probably the average being around 20%, I think. So I can't say that it's necessarily, just across deep tech, but I just say like, I would say average, in the tech sector, generally speaking, this is what a first round usually looks like.
And
I'm sorry, I spoke over you.
No, that's okay. Did you want to add to that?
No, I just want to say I was going to go into the second point here because I was reading it, but you might want to, if you want to read it out, you can.
It's just how do you determine deep tech fair valuation for future potential markets?
That's outside. I don't know the answer to that. So that is not. I don't deal with valuations. But it really depends on a sector, and it depends on how hot or cold things are. And it's very, and especially in seed rounds, it's very, very difficult to figure out. Oftentimes, it's really dependent on, traction and how far along you are. So it's hard to tell.
And a third question is there an advantage in keeping equity for future employees from the start? For example, if there are two co-founders, each will get 40 and the remaining 10% will be kept for future employees.
I don't think so. I think that's not the way that I usually, I don't want to be so kind of definitive here, but that's not the way I think about it usually. The way I think about it is if you're going to issue it to future employees, then when you do issue it, you issue it. There's a disadvantage to thinking like this. So the first disadvantage is you don't really know when you start off in a company, you really don't know who you're going to issue the equity to right just yet. And you don't know when you're going to issue the equity to folks, because a lot of times, let's say you have a 10% allocation that you're giving for future employees, that's not going to really be distributed until you raise some money, because these folks, you're going to have to bring them onto your team. And they're not going to just get equity typically. They're going to get a little bit of cash too. So that's going to come later. Another disadvantage is when you go raise a round of financing, typically what you have is a pool of equity that the investor a lot of times insists that you allocate as part of the round. And the reason they insist on doing this is because they do not want to be diluted by this. So let's say they're going to get, if you have, let's say, two founders that have 50%, and then they're going to raise a round of financing where they're going to give away, let's say, 30%. The investor is will likely insist that, let's say, that in addition to them being diluted by 30% in this round of financing, I'm talking about the founders, the investor will insist that you, before the round, or like immediately before the round, like as part of the round, they're going to allocate another 10% for future employees. And the reason they want to make sure that this happens right before the round is so that when they get the money and when they have the capital and they want to start growing and bringing on new team members, these allocations of equity won't dilute the investor. So if you do it too early, you might misshoot the amount of equity that you're trying to reserve and end up diluting yourself more than you really need to. Because a good situation would be you have a pool that is, that you have a reasonable sized pool, and then let's say you allocate everything, and then you have to go back to the investor later on and say, look, we need to issue a little bit more equity. We have all these needs. And the investor agrees to increase the pool, which means that the dilution from that increase in the equity later on is sort of suffered by everybody equally, including the investor, which means that the founders aren't diluted as much.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions that people would like to ask Darie directly? And actually, we got one more on the message board, so I'll open this too. It says, hold on. We've got a few in here. All right. So it says, what do you think about simple agreement for future equity trend?
I like it. I think that simple agreement for future equity is also known as a SAFE, is a type of convertible instrument that's very, very short. That is sort of an evolution from a previous trend in issuing equity. So just to start from the beginning, in the beginning, before when folks had a startup and they wanted to bring on an investor, they would just give the investor stock. What they realize in startups is that it's very, very difficult to understand valuations, especially early on. And it ends up becoming very, very complicated and expensive. So the next step in the process was to create this sort of derivative equity, something called convertible equity, where the investor would actually loan money at an interest with an interest rate, and there would be all kinds of restrictions. They would treat these loans like a traditional, almost like half like a bank loan, with lots of restrictive covenants and obligations on disclosure and things like that. But they would give them a loan, and then if something happened, if there was what's called a qualified financing, the loan would convert into equity, and this would usually happen in the next round of financing. The next step in this evolution was that these convertible notes became very, very short, and they realized that all of these additional covenants and stuff was just too complicated. Really, what we're talking about is sort of like a middle instrument that we can use in order to get money into the hands of founders quickly and give the investors a discount for coming in early off whatever comes in the future. If they come in the future, they're going to get some kind of benefit for it, whether it's like a maximum price they're going to pay or some discount on whatever valuation comes next. So the next step in this evolution was to realize that this idea of a loan is really not the right way, because a loan is not the right way to think about this. This isn't really a loan. For example, if there is no next round of financing, and and this lender or the investor, just sitting on this instrument and the maturity date comes and like, the loan is due, are they really going to ask for the money back from this startup that clearly doesn't have any money? What are you, there's no way they're really going to ever get the money back like this. They're not going to call these notes. I mean, there are certain situations where investors try to call notes, but that's not considered necessarily great behavior. And it's also not typically what happens. So they realize that that's not the point of this. This is not really a loan. This is a special kind of financing, what we call high resolution finance, like a way to quickly invest in the company. So the next step in this evolution was a safe. And a safe is basically like a convertible note, but without all of the interest. And there's people that like it and people that don't like it. Some people think that it's terrible for investors. Some people think that it's overly dilutive for founders. One of the biggest negative aspects to a safe and to convertible notes in general is because it's difficult to figure out how much it converts into equity. A lot of times founders don't accurately estimate how much they're being diluted by these notes. And they keep on getting more and more and more notes. They keep on stacking one upon the other. And then when they do a round of financing, they realize that the investor is not going to get diluted by these notes, only they are. And suddenly their equity gets squeezed down completely. So I think they can be very useful, but it's also very important to not overuse them.
And do you have any other specific points for deep tech startups?
For deep tech startups in particular, I mean, I think this is also, again, not really within what I'm talking about here, but it's just, but IP obviously is a huge consideration. Very important not to deploy products. This is, again, I'm not an IP lawyer, but not to deploy products into the market before you've I mean, sometimes you have to, but to try to consider ways that you can protect your intellectual property before you deploy products into the market or even reveal them to investors, because these things can be considered sort of a release to the public domain. And if you try to protect them later on, you may be susceptible to more challenges. That's specifically to deep tech, but nothing else that I can think of right now specifically.
And do we have any other questions that anyone would like to ask Darie directly before we close? Oh, we got even one more, sorry. In the past, at least in Israel, it was assumed that the co-founders will not get a salary early on. Is that the case also today?
So, I mean, I know less about Israel today. I've been practicing in the US for a little while, but I think today, I think this applies also to Israel, founders take a salary, they take something. It's not going to be a lot. And it's not that I think, well, let's put it another way. If there's no money in the beginning, there's nothing to take. But the idea is, when you have money, do you take a salary? I think that's the question. Of course, like when you start a startup, if you don't have anything, you're not going to pay yourself what you don't have. But when you raise money from an investor in today's market, it is not expected that you work for free after having raised a round of financing. I would say this is true for what I would call like a seed ABC financing for sure. But if you're raising on a convertible note, and it depends on who you're raising from, they may have different thoughts on it. But certainly for I think those for the like straight equity financings, I think it is assumed that you're going to allocate some to yourself for salary.
Well, on that note, on behalf of Paul Mirage and the Mirage Institute, Darie, we highly appreciate you taking the time today to enlighten our Mirage tribe. And thank you everyone for joining us, and happy Purim. Until next week.
Thank you all. Nice meeting you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.